It was the winter of 1987, in a small industrial town tucked against the edge of a river whose waters ran dark with the memory of old factories. The air was cold enough to make each breath linger like smoke, and snow clung stubbornly to the rusting rooftops. Just beyond the outskirts, past a web of cracked asphalt roads and leaning telephone poles, stood the old power plant, its concrete walls streaked white. Its tall smokestacks piercing a pale gray sky. Few went near it anymore, its gates were locked, its windows blind with dust. But inside those walls, on one particular night, a man named David Mercer disappeared without a sound. David was 39, a maintenance supervisor who knew every inch of the plant's machinery, every corridor, every humming panel. He had been called in after hours for what was supposed to be a routine inspection. The plant was weeks from being permanently shut down, and he joked to his wife earlier that evening about tucking the place into bed. The call came just after 9. By 10, he'd driven through the snow, parked his pickup in the lot, and walked inside. That was the last time anyone saw him. Hours passed, midnight came. The plant sat silent against the wind, its tall windows dark except for the faint glow from the control room on the second floor. In the morning, David's truck was still there, his coat hung on the back of a chair, the keys to the building were neatly placed on the desk. But David himself was nowhere, as though he had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. It would be 14 years before anything new about that night came to light. 14 long years in which the mystery hardened, in which theories grew like vines over every missing piece of the story. And when the truth, or something like it, finally emerged, it didn't come from the places anyone expected. It came from deep inside the plant itself, from the one room that was supposed to have been powerless for decades. Before that night, David Mercer's life was the kind people in town rarely thought twice about. He lived in a modest red brick house on Maple Street with his wife, Claire, and their 12-year-old daughter, Hannah. He was the kind of man who waved to the mail carrier, who shoveled not only his own driveway but the widow's 2 doors down. His hands were always rough from work, his nails carrying a faint stain of engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. He liked things orderly, the lawn trimmed, the tools in his shed hung exactly where they belonged. And yet there was an ease to him, a quiet humor that made people feel comfortable. Most evenings after supper, David would retreat to the small den at the back of the house. He kept an old shortwave radio there, its surface scratched and smelling faintly of solder. He'd tune into far-off stations, listening to voices that seemed to float in from another world. Sometimes he'd let Hannah join him, showing her the glowing dials, explaining how the static meant someone far away was speaking. Claire said it was a habit left over from his Navy days, when he'd man communication lines during long shifts at sea. Whatever it was his one indulgence, that, and his Saturday fishing trips with his friend Tom Keating. The week before he vanished had been unremarkable in every way. Snow had fallen steadily, and David spent his evenings clearing the walk and drinking coffee by the kitchen window. He'd been helping Hannah with a school science project, something about magnetism, and the two of them had cluttered the dining table with little comp. Asses and nails wrapped in copper wire. Claire remembered how he laughed when the magnet picked up a stray screw that had rolled under the chair. But she also remembered something else. The night before he left for the plant, as they were locking up for bed, David paused at the back door, looking out toward the street. "Funny," he said, "thought I saw someone standing by the lamppost." When Claire followed his gaze, there was no one there, just a swirl of snow under the orange light. If he was troubled by it, he didn't say. The next day he rose early, drove Hannah to school, and spent the afternoon in his garage replacing a cracked belt on the snowblower. In the evening, over a plate of roast chicken, he told Claire about the call from the plant manager, how one of the turbines had tripped its breaker. "Gain, just a quick check," he said, "probably a loose wire." He kissed Hannah goodnight, pulled on his heavy coat, and promised to be home before midnight. Nothing in his tone, his face, or his manner hinted that he was about to step into the kind of night that leaves no return. In the days leading up to his disappearance, there were small moments that, in hindsight, seemed to whisper that something was out of place. Tom Keating remembered how David had shown up late to their usual Saturday fishing trip, distracted, his tackle box half forgotten in the back of the truck. When Tom asked if everything was all right, David just shrugged and said he'd been thinking about something that didn't quite add up at the plant. He didn't explain further, but his eyes lingered on the frozen river as if trying to work out a puzzle no one else could see. Claire noticed it too, the way he would stand at the window after dinner, staring down the street as though expecting someone to appear. Twice that week she found him in the garage late at night, the overhead light buzzing softly, his hands idle on the workbench. He'd claim he was fixing something, but nothing was ever taken apart. One night she asked if he was worried about the upcoming closure of the plant. He gave a tight smile, said, "It's not the plant I'm worried about," then changed the subject. Even Hannah sensed a difference. She told her mother that Dad had been quieter during their project, sometimes tapping the table absent-mindedly like he was listening for a sound only. He could hear. On Tuesday evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she overheard him on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was low, urgent. When he noticed her in the doorway, he ended the call quickly and told her to run along. Then there was the matter of the old key. Claire found it in his coat pocket while doing laundry, heavy brass, with a faded tag that simply read North Room. She didn't recall ever seeing it before, and when she asked about it, David just said it was from a storage closet at the plant, nothing worth talking about. But the next morning, she saw him slip it into his wallet instead of returning it to the key ring in the kitchen. No one could have known it then, but these were the breadcrumbs, small, strange details that meant little on their own. At the time they were easy to brush aside. But later, after the night he vanished, each of these moments would take on a sharper edge, as though the truth had been there all along, hiding in PL. Ain sight. It was the night of January 14, 1987. The snow had stopped falling hours earlier, leaving the streets glazed in a thin layer of ice that cracked softly under the tires of David's truck. The moon hung low, a pale coin behind drifting clouds, casting a muted silver light over the skeletal frame of the power plant. Its smokestacks loomed like silent sentinels against the sky. Inside his coat pocket, the brass North Room key pressed cold against his hand. He didn't tell Claire he had brought it with him. The plant's outer gate creaked open when he pushed it. Beyond, the parking lot was deserted, save for a lone maintenance truck half buried in snow. David pulled up close to the side entrance, the headlights briefly catching the frost on the metal door. When he stepped inside, the warmth hit him like a whisper from the past. The place still smelled faintly of oil and burnt dust, as if it had been Ali. All this time, somewhere deep within the building, a low hum echoed through the steel beams. It shouldn't have been there. The turbines were supposed to be offline. The last confirmed sighting came from Harold Bloom, the night watchman, who swore he saw David heading up the metal staircase toward the control room. At exactly 10:22 p.m. Harold remembered calling out a greeting, but David didn't answer. He just kept walking, his boots ringing against the steps, a flashlight beam sweeping ahead of him. Moments later, the light disappeared into the second-floor corridor. What happened next is known only through fragments. A faint flicker of illumination from the control room windows was visible from the road around 10:40, then silence, no movement. No sign of anyone leaving. At 11:05, Harold climbed the stairs himself, only to find the control room empty. David's coat was draped over a chair. His truck keys sat neatly beside the main console. The monitors, long thought dead, glowed with faint green text that scrolled too fast to read. And on the far side of the room, the door to the North Room stood ajar, its hinges groaning softly in the draft. By 11:15, Harold had searched every visible corridor, no footprints in the snow outside, no unlocked doors. It was as if David had stepped through that half-open doorway and into a space that no longer belonged to the world they knew. The search began before dawn, when Harold finally drove through the icy streets to the police station and reported that David was missing. By the time the first light touched the rooftops, patrol cars were pulling into the plant's lot, their tires crunching through frozen slush. Officers moved quickly through the building, their flashlights slicing the darkness, the beams catching dust motes that drifted like ash in the cold. Every stairwell, every storage room, every corridor was checked. The north room was searched twice, a cramped, windowless space with metal shelves and old filing cabinets, nothing out of the ordinary except for the smell. It was faint, metallic, almost like ozone after a lightning strike. Claire arrived mid-morning, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her face pale from the bitter wind and sleepless night. She kept glancing toward David's truck, still parked exactly where he had left it, the thin layer of frost on the windshield undisturbed. She called his name again and again as she followed the officers inside, her voice echoing through the plant's hollow chambers. Hannah waited in the car with a neighbor, her small hands pressed to the window, eyes searching for her father. By midday, more help arrived, volunteers from town, off-duty plant workers, even Tom Keating, still in his fishing cap, his breath rising in clouds, as he joined the search line. They combed the area surrounding the plant, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the riverbank, scanning for footprints, broken ice, any sign that David might have wandered outside. Dogs were brought in, their handlers guiding them through the maze of machinery and along the frozen shoreline. The dogs picked up a scent inside the plant but lost it abruptly near the control room door, as if the trail simply dissolved. Theories began to swirl before the day was over. Some thought he had slipped on the catwalks and fallen into one of the deep maintenance shafts, though none were open or unguarded. Others whispered about the plant's long-rumored underground passages, relics from its construction in the 1920s, sealed off for decades but still rumored to exist. A few muttered about the control room's inexplicable power, the glow of those monitors, the hum in the air, but kept their voices low, wary of sound. Foolish, by nightfall, the official search radius had stretched half a mile in every direction. Police cars idled at the gates, their red and blue lights spinning lazily against the snow. Inside the plant, the air grew colder. David's coat, still draped over the chair in the control room, seemed to sag a little more, as though it too understood he was not coming back that night. And as the search teams gathered to regroup, there was a heavy, unspoken truth settling over everyone present: whatever had happened to David Mercer. It had begun and perhaps ended within those walls. Days turned into weeks, and the hope that had driven the first frantic searches began to thin like mist in the cold air. The police kept the plant sealed off, but each new sweep brought back the same report: nothing, no footprints, no personal belongings. No signs of a struggle. It was as if the building itself had swallowed David whole. Detectives interviewed every plant employee, from the engineers to the janitors, but no one could offer more than vague recollections of the week's biff. Or he vanished. The night watchman, Harold, repeated his account so many times it began to sound rehearsed, though the tremor in his voice never quite went away. Theory shifted and fractured. Some believed David had staged his own disappearance, though no one could explain why a man so deeply rooted in his family and routine would simply walk away. Others wondered if foul play had been involved, a dispute over the plant's impending closure perhaps, or something darker tied to the building's Yet without evidence, every idea collapsed under its own weight. For Claire, the uncertainty was worse than grief. She found herself wandering the house at night, pausing at the doorway to the den where David's radio still sat on the desk. She couldn't bring herself to turn it on, afraid she might hear something she couldn't explain. Hannah stopped asking when her father was coming home, but Claire caught her leaving the porch light on every evening, even after being told to conserve electricity. The search budget ran dry by late February. Police scaled back their involvement, leaving the case in the hands of a smaller investigative team that could do little more than revisit old reports. Volunteers stopped coming by the plant, worn down by the cold and the lack of progress. The dogs were never brought back. Even Tom, who had sworn to keep looking until there was an answer, began to miss days. There was only so long a man could walk through those empty corridors without feeling something pressing in from the dark. The control room, once buzzing with investigators and humming with unexplained power, grew still again. The monitors were dark now, the console cold to the touch. But Harold swore that sometimes, while making his rounds, he would pass by the heavy door and hear it, a faint, rhythmic clicking like the sound of a relay switch being thrown over and over. When he mentioned it to the police, they shrugged. Without proof, it was just another strange story in a case already drowning in them. By the time spring crept in and the snow melted from the streets, David Mercer's name had slipped from the front page to the back, and then from the papers altogether. But for the few who had been there in those first days, who had walked those silent halls, felt that inexplicable hum in the air, the absence did no feel like an ending. It felt like a door left half open, waiting for someone to notice. It was nearly 14 years later, in the autumn of 2001, when the first new thread in David Mercer's case surfaced. The power plant had long since been decommissioned, its windows boarded, its gates chained shut. The building was scheduled for partial demolition, and a small crew was sent in to remove any salvageable equipment. Among them was a man named Paul Ridley, an electrician who had once worked under David in the late 80s. On a damp October morning, he was tasked with dismantling old control panels from the second floor. Paul was moving slowly through the dust-choked corridors when he reached the control room. The air inside felt different, cooler somehow, despite the warmth of the day outside. He noticed that one of the smaller panels near the back wall was still sealed with an older-style lock. Out of habit, he ran his hand along the metal surface and felt something lodged in the narrow gap between the panel and the wall. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle at the edges, its surface smudged with what looked like grease. He slipped it into his pocket, intending to toss it later, but curiosity got the better of him during his lunch break. When he unfolded it, he found a hand-drawn diagram of the plant's layout, but not the one he remembered. This map included an extra corridor branching off from the north wing, leading to a rectangular space labeled only as Sublevel 3. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably David's. Paul had seen him jot notes hundreds of times during maintenance work. At first, he thought it was some outdated sketch from the plant's construction days. But what unsettled him was that the access point to this mysterious sublevel was marked with a small X directly beside the door to the north room. And in the bottom corner of the paper in faint pencil was a single line of writing, "If I'm not back, don't follow." Paul didn't say anything to the demolition crew. Instead, he took the paper home and stared at it for hours that night, tracing the lines with his finger, remembering the rumors about hidden passages. Under the plant, the next morning he made a quiet phone call, not to the police but to Claire Mercer. When she answered, her voice carried the careful distance of someone long resigned to an absence. But when Paul told her what he had found, the silence on the other end felt like it might never end. That single, fragile sheet of paper would bring life back to a case that had been cold for more than a decade. And for the first time since David's disappearance, there was something tangible, something real, a clue that seemed to point directly at the night he vanished. What neither Paul nor Claire knew then was that this map was not a beginning, it was a warning. Paul and Claire met 2 days later, just after dusk, in the parking lot outside the old plant. The demolition work had paused for the weekend, and the site was silent except for the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the asphalt. Claire looked smaller than Paul remembered, her coat hanging loose, her eyes fixed on the chain-link fence as if she could see through it. She held the folded map in her gloved hand, its edges now protected by a plastic sleeve. They slipped inside through a section of fence that had already been cut by the work crew. The plant loomed above them, its windows black against the fading light. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rust and stale water. Their footsteps echoed in the vast, empty halls as they made their way to the control room. Paul's flashlight beam slid across the dust-covered consoles, the cold metal glinting dully. At the far wall, just as the map showed, was the door to the north room, Its paint was peeling in long strips, the handle stiff from disuse. Paul pushed it open and they stepped into the cramped space. He swept the flashlight across the floor, following the map's markings, until it landed on a section of wall that looked wrong. The paint was cleaner there, as if it had been touched more recently than the rest. Paul tapped it with his knuckles. The sound was hollow. He crouched, running his fingers along the seam where the wall met the floor, and found a recessed latch, small, almost invisible. When he pulled it, the panel shifted with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that drifted up was cold and dry, carrying that same faint metallic tang Paul had noticed when he first found the map. Claire hesitated at the top, her hand tightening around the flashlight. "We shouldn't," she whispered, but Paul was already descending. The steps were steep, the concrete slick with condensation. The light barely pierced the shadows below, revealing a corridor lined with rusted pipes. They moved slowly, their footsteps muffled by the close air. At the far end of the passage, a heavy steel door waited, its surface marred by deep scratches. Someone had tried to pry it open once, or tried to claw their way out. Paul swallowed hard, pushed, and the hinges groaned in protest. Beyond was a room far larger than they expected, lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center stood an old workstation, its surface cluttered with tools, a cracked mug, and a stack of logbooks coated in dust. The smell was stronger here, a sharp electric scent that made Claire's eyes water. Paul opened one of the logbooks and the handwriting leapt out at him, David's. Page after page filled with dates, sketches, and strange sequences of numbers. The entries stopped abruptly on January 14, 1987. The final line read, "Power still running, not alone down here." Somewhere in the dark beyond the workstation, a faint clicking sound began, steady, deliberate, coming closer. Paul froze, the hair rising on his arms. Claire's voice was barely audible. "Paul, we need to go." But the sound didn't stop, it grew louder. And in that stale, humming air, they both knew this was no echo from the past, it was something still here. Paul's grip tightened on the edge of the workstation as the clicking echoed through the room. It wasn't random, it had rhythm, like someone tapping a pen in a deliberate pattern. Claire's flashlight beam shook, dancing over the rusted pipes and shadowed corners until it landed on the far wall. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from behind a row of dented metal cabinets, something shifted. Paul's chest tightened. "Who's there?" His voice cracked in the cold air. The clicking stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the darkness itself. Claire stepped closer to him, her breath visible in the flickering light. Then, the sound began again, this time from their left. Both of them turned sharply, but there was nothing in the beam's reach. Paul felt the urge to leave, to run back up those stairs, but the logbook on the table kept pulling his eyes back. That last sentence, "not alone down here," echoed in his mind. He slid the book into his backpack without thinking, his fingers trembling. A sudden metallic clang rang out from the corridor they'd come through, like a pipe being struck hard. Claire gasped. "It's blocking the way," she whispered. Paul didn't want to believe her, but the thought hit him with the force of truth. If something had moved in behind them, the narrow stairwell could be cut off completely. He swung the flashlight toward the steel door, meaning to bolt for it, but the light caught on something near the floor. A small, circular stain, darker than the surrounding concrete. He crouched, touching it with his fingertips, and they came away tacky. It wasn't rust. The faint, coppery smell hit him at once. Claire tugged at his sleeve. "Paul, we have to go now?" Her voice carried a quiver he'd never heard before. They backed toward the corridor, keeping the beam sweeping across the room. The clicking had stopped again, but now there was another sound, a slow, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled along the floor. Halfway to the door, Paul's foot caught on something. He looked down to see a heavy cable snaking across the floor, leading into the shadows. Only, as his light followed it, he realized it wasn't a cable at all. It was a length of thick, braided rope tied into a noose at the far end, swaying slightly as if it had just been disturbed. A chill settled into his bones. The rope was old, frayed in places, but the knot was fresh, too fresh. Paul's pulse hammered in his ears. Without another word, he grabbed Claire's arm and pulled her through the steel door. The passage felt narrower now, the air colder, the darkness pressing in. Somewhere behind them, from deep in the room they'd just left, came a single, sharp tap like a knuckle on metal, then another. Then three in quick succession. Paul didn't know if it was a message or a warning. All he knew was they weren't imagining it, something was down here. And it knew they were leaving. They hurried through the corridor, their footsteps loud against the concrete, echoing back at them like someone was following just a few steps behind. Claire's breathing was sharp and uneven, and Paul could feel her hand trembling against his arm. The beam of the flashlight swung wildly with every step, cutting through the stale air, catching glimpses of peeling paint and rusted railings. At the end of the hall, the stairwell appeared, a square of shadow framed by cold steel walls. Paul reached for the railing, but his hand stopped mid-air. There was a sound coming from above. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending, each one heavier than the last. Claire froze beside him, neither of them spoke. The light flickered once, then again, as if something was interfering with it. Paul adjusted his grip and took a step back, glancing over his shoulder. The darkness behind them seemed thicker now, like it was swallowing the edges of the corridor. He realized they were trapped between whatever was coming down the stairs and whatever was still in the control room. A faint hum began to rise from somewhere deep in the plant, low and constant, vibrating through the floor. It wasn't the sound of machinery restarting. It felt older, like a resonance building inside the walls themselves. Claire leaned in, whispering so softly he barely heard her. "It's still running, it never stopped." Paul tightened his jaw, his eyes darting between the stairs and the way they had come. The footsteps from above grew closer, accompanied by the faint clink of metal. He could smell something now, a strange mix of oil, dust, and something burnt. With no better option, he pulled Claire toward a side door halfway down the corridor. It resisted at first, hinges stiff from decades of neglect, but then gave way with a groan that echoed like a warning. They slipped inside, closing it as quietly as they could. The room beyond was small, lined with shelves stacked high with tools, coiled wires, and dusty glass jars. A single desk sat in the corner, papers scattered across it. Paul moved the flashlight over the surface, stopping on a yellowed blueprint. It showed the layout of the plant, but there was something odd, a section of the lower levels that wasn't labeled, connected to the control room by a narrow shaft. Claire's voice trembled as she pointed to it. "That's where it's coming from." Before Paul could answer, the footsteps stopped right outside the door. The handle rattled once, then went still, neither of them breathed. And then from the other side came a slow, deliberate knock 3 times, evenly spaced. What happened after that night remains unclear. Paul and Claire never spoke publicly about what they saw, and the plant itself was quietly fenced off just weeks later. Official records list it as a hazard site, unsafe for entry, but locals still say they've seen faint light in the high windows on foggy nights and that same low hum drifting through the air when the wind is still. Whatever's hidden in those lower levels, whatever's been running all these years without a soul to maintain it, it hasn't stopped. And maybe it was never meant to. If you've ever heard a story like this in your own town, or if you think you know what could still be operating inside that control room, I want to hear. Are your thoughts? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you'd like to join me as we uncover more of these forgotten places and the secrets they refuse to let go, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery. Because somewhere out there another door is still locked, waiting to be opened.